My son smirked at me during the reading of my ex-wife's $34 million will. "Don't expect a penny," he whispered. He sat back, grinning, certain I was cut out. But then the lawyer cleared his throat and read one final sentence. My son's smile froze. Mine slowly returned. This isn't just a story about money or inheritance. It's about how the person you once knew, the person who ripped your heart out, can, in their final breath, offer a redemption so profound it shakes the very foundations of your world. I walked into that will reading expecting nothing, maybe even some final insult from the woman who'd shattered my life. But when the lawyer spoke those words, the room didn't just shake, my son's smug smile shattered into a furious scream that told me everything had just changed. Just days before, my world was a symphony of small annoyances. Mrs. Henderson's voice, shrill as a banshee, ripped through my thin apartment wall. "Your damn sprinklers, Jerry." I sighed, on my hands and knees, wiping up coffee I'd just spilled. 65 years old, still cleaning up messes, and honestly, the sprinklers weren't entirely my fault. I'd installed them, sure, but that one loose joint. Eleanor Henderson just didn't have patience for explanations. Then the phone rang. And rang. And rang, cutting through Eleanor's tirade about property values and inconsiderate tenants. On the fifth ring, I stood, tossing the soaked towel into the sink. "Jerry Flores speaking." "Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison, Welsh and Associates." That professional, careful tone. You know the one. The kind that always precedes bad news. "I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores." My hand tightened around the receiver. Brianna Elizabeth. No one had used her full name in my presence for 15 years. "What about her?" "Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening." The words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly deafening in the silence. Tuesday evening. That was 3 days ago. 3 days I'd been worrying about leaky sprinklers and coffee stains while the woman I'd once loved, the mother of my son, was just gone. "Yes, I'm here," I managed, my voice sounding distant, foreign. "How did you get my number?" "Your name was listed in Mrs. Flores's personal effects as an emergency contact." "I understand you were previously married." "Previously married, 22 years, reduced to a legal footnote." "Yes, we divorced in 2010. The words came out automatically, muscle memory from years of forms. "I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated." Beneficiary, the word felt impossible. Brianna had built her empire after our divorce, transforming her small consulting business into something I barely recognized from newspaper articles. What could she possibly have left me? Through the window, Eleanor was still gesticulating at her waterlogged petunias, but her complaints seemed to come from another world now. Muffled. Insignificant. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Which one did you say?" "Riverside Memorial on Grand Avenue. Service at 2, will reading at 4:30 in our downtown offices." I found myself nodding, though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I just sat there, staring at the phone, as if it might ring again and deliver different news. Brianna. Vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brianna. Gone. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing like memories I'd tried so hard to forget. Brianna Elizabeth Flores, her name echoed in my mind, pulling me back through time to a snowy February evening in 1987, standing in Murphy's Diner, watching a woman in a red wool coat argue with the manager. "You're telling me you won't consider female applicants for weekend manager because women can't handle the pressure?" Her voice, clear and uncompromising, cut through the nearly empty restaurant. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week." I'd stopped mid-bite of my apple pie, fork suspended. She turned slightly, and I saw her profile, sharp cheekbones, a determined jaw, dark hair catching the fluorescent light. She was magnificent in her anger. I secretly hoped the manager would keep arguing just so I could listen to her tear his logic apart. "Ma'am, I didn't mean any offense." "Of course you didn't mean offense," she retorted, pulling a business card from her purse and sliding it across the counter. "You just meant to discriminate. When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me." The door chimes jingled as she left, and the diner felt smaller, somehow drained of electricity. "That one's trouble," the manager muttered loud enough for the whole place to hear. I stood up, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. "No," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. "That one's extraordinary." The business card lay abandoned. Brianna Chin, business consultant. I memorized the number before stepping into the February wind. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. "Brianna Chin," she answered, briskly. "This is Jerry Flores. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night." A pause. Then, the man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. "You heard that?" I was getting my gloves from the car. "You left a good tip, too." I could hear the smile in her voice. "So, Jerry Flores, what can I do for you?" "Have dinner with me. Somewhere better than Murphy's." Another pause. Longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date. Though if you have any advice about convincing beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." She laughed then. A real laugh. Saturday night, Romano's on 3rd Street, 7 o'clock. She wore the red coat again, but underneath was a black dress that made my pulse race. We talked for 3 hours about everything except business, her childhood, my job at the power plant, old movies, new books. When she laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner. "Marry me, Brianna Chin. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming." She said yes before I'd finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, the kind that makes promises feel possible. "Forever," she whispered as I slipped the ring onto her finger. And I believed her, completely. Dustin arrived 2 years later, a squalling, red-faced miracle. I remember standing in the hospital room, watching Brianna cradle our son with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, thinking that this perfect moment, was all I'd ever need. But even then, holding that perfect baby, I noticed how Brianna's eyes occasionally drifted to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Dustin grew, I began to notice things I'd missed. When he turned 7, Brianna bought him a computer, a serious machine worth more than my monthly salary. "He needs to understand technology," she explained. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally." I'd suggested teaching him to fish instead. She'd laughed, but not kindly. We moved to Hillcrest Avenue, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brianna's firm landed a massive contract. Suddenly, we had money for things I'd never imagined needing. A housekeeper, an ice-dispensing fridge, Dustin's bedroom looking like a toy store. "Isn't this wonderful?" Brianna asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room with its crystal chandelier. "We can finally entertain properly." I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from Dustin's coloring projects and our late-night talks. This new table reflected light like a mirror, demanding coasters and placemats. The entertaining started immediately. Business associates, clients, successful couples whose conversations revolved around market share. I'd wear my best shirt, try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language badly. "Jerry works at the power plant," Brianna would explain when someone asked, and I heard something new in her voice. Not pride, but an apologetic edge, as if my job required an excuse. Dustin thrived in this new world. At 10, he was discussing programming with Brianna's tech clients. At 12, he critiqued restaurant wine lists. At 14, he rolled his eyes at my suggestions for camping trips, preferring Brianna's business conferences. "Dad doesn't understand" became his favorite phrase, delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone far too sophisticated for mundane concerns. The first real fight came on Dustin's 15th birthday. Brianna planned a party that looked more like a corporate networking event, catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list full of business contacts. I'd wanted something simpler. A barbecue with his school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before. "He's 15, not 50. He's growing up in a different world than we did, Jerry," she said, adjusting a centerpiece with the same precision she brought to contract negotiations. "These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future." What about just being a kid? She turned to face me fully, and for a moment, I saw something cold in her eyes. Calculation where there used to be warmth. Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give him. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose. I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my father, a homemade cake, presents wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. The party was a success by Brianna's standards. Dustin charmed the adults, networked with their children, received gifts that spoke of serious money. But I caught him once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened quickly, slipping back into the persona Brianna had helped him craft. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little boy underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end. What followed were 10 years of slow-motion disaster. Brianna's business consumed her time, her attention, her soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacations were cancelled. Dustin's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I complained about missing another of Dustin's baseball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from making sure thousands had electricity. The difference was, my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he'd become a stranger to me. Brianna had groomed him into her perfect prodigy, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested he consider trade school along with college, he looked at me like I'd suggested he become a medieval serf. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said. 17 years old, already talking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity." I won't make that mistake. Settled for mediocrity, the words hit like physical blows. As if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if being a steady, present father was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Dustin chose business school, Brianna's alma mater, naturally. He came home for holidays full of theories about market dynamics and personal optimization. He looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Dad," he'd say, as if my contentment was a personal failing. "Mom started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money," I'd reply, but he'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during his senior year. Brianna had been working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition. I'd been handling everything at home, groceries, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When she missed Dustin's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Brianna. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our kitchen, that crystal and granite shrine to success, still wearing her business suit at midnight, checking emails on her phone. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Dustin's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost?" "Like what?" She finally looked up from her phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in her eyes before she spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working," she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Brianna's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Maple Street, our old starter home she'd kept as a rental, and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Dustin's unquestioned loyalty. "You're holding him back, too," Dustin told me during one of our last conversations before he moved to Denver to work for Brianna's company. "All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore." I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. Now, 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading outside my apartment window. My coffee had grown cold. The ceramic shards still scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever. And I had no idea why she'd remembered my name in her will. The 3 days between Janet Morrison's call and the funeral had passed in a strange, suspended state. I'd cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning, I'd considered not going. But each evening found me still committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived, gray and cold. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting the tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brianna would think of the man I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Silver hair where brown used to be. Lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes, through neighborhoods that told the story of Rock Springs' economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to middle-class subdivisions, then to the manicured lawns and stone facades where Brianna's circle lived. The chapel sat on a hill, its Gothic architecture suggesting permanence and prosperity. Cars lined the drive, Mercedes, BMWs, a handful of Teslas that probably cost more than I'd made in my best year. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, feeling like an intruder at someone else's celebration. The chapel's interior whispered money, mahogany pews, stained glass windows, flowers arranged with artistic precision. At least 200 people filled the space, their conversations a low hum of respectful mourning mixed with business networking. I recognized some faces from the business dinners Brianna had dragged me to during our marriage, but most were strangers from the life she'd built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible. But whispers followed my arrival like ripples in still water. A woman in an expensive black suit nudged her companion, pointing discreetly. I caught fragments, her ex-husband. Can you believe he'd, after what he put her through? The stories had taken on their own life over the years. Apparently, in this version, I was the villain, the anchor that had nearly drowned her ambitions. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Dad. The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up to see Dustin striding down the aisle, his face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 37, he'd inherited Brianna's sharp features and commanding presence, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Success radiated from him, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, turning heads and silencing conversations. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. He moved closer, close enough I could smell his cologne, something sophisticated and aggressive. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not, but I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were? The chapel had gone completely quiet now. 200 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation like spectators at a sporting event. I felt the familiar weight of judgment, the same pressure that had suffocated me during those final years of our marriage. But this time, something was different. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Dustin. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. His voice rose another notch, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death. I remained standing, holding his stare. Around us, the chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. A cell phone vibrated. Before I could respond, Dustin turned to address the gathered mourners, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. He gestured toward me with the casual dismissal of someone swatting a fly. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. I felt heat rising in my cheeks but forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Dustin continued, warming to his theme, this is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire that employed hundreds of people, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Dustin, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. He turned back to the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now, a few heads nodding in agreement. I saw faces I recognized, former neighbors, people I'd considered friends during the marriage. None of them met my eyes. She supported him for years while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word landed like a physical blow. Not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. My mother died building something that will outlast all of us, Dustin concluded, his voice rising with conviction. She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the continued humiliation. But another part, the part that had loved Brianna Chin more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Dustin's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, his confidence flickered for just a moment. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as her husband. 18 more as someone who wished her well despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, apparently unprepared for resistance to his public trial. "The service will begin in 5 minutes," someone announced from the front of the chapel. The funeral director, probably trying to restore order. Dustin shot me one final look of contempt before striding toward the front pew reserved for family. As conversations gradually resumed, I caught fragments of continued gossip. Nerve of some people. Poor Dustin having to deal with this. Should have stayed home. But I stayed. Through the eulogy that painted Brianna as a visionary, through the readings from business associates who spoke of her leadership, through the musical selections that emphasized triumph over adversity. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Dustin while pointedly ignoring me. I waited until the chapel had mostly emptied before standing to leave. Mr. Flores. A man in an expensive suit approached. Middle-aged, professional, carrying a leather briefcase. Dan Morrison from Morrison, Welsh and Associates. "Could I have a word?" As the last hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over me. The ordeal was nearly over. I could slip out, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this humiliating experience. I was reaching for my jacket when his voice stopped me again. "Mr. Flores." Dan Morrison approached, his expensive suit impeccable. Up close, he looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of handling wealthy clients. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, extending his hand. Dan Morrison. We spoke briefly after the service. "Thank you." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. The service was very nice. Brianna would have appreciated it. Indeed. She was quite specific about her final arrangements. He paused, glancing around the emptying chapel. "I wonder if I might have a word with you and Dustin. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Flores's estate." Before I could respond, Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. "Dan, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things." "Of course, Dustin. These matters require careful attention." Dan's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering important news. I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will. Both of us? Dustin's eyebrows rose. Is that necessary? I mean, he's not. He gestured vaguely in my direction. Your father is specifically named in the will. That seemed unlikely given everything that had passed between Brianna and me. More likely some minor formality, perhaps forgiving an old debt or confirming I had no claim. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there. Dan's eyes met mine directly. I'm afraid I do, Mr. Flores. Mrs. Flores was very specific about who should be present for the reading. Both you and Dustin must be there. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Dustin looked annoyed but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew he had nothing to worry about. Fine, let's get this over with. He turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to Dan's office took us 3 blocks through downtown Rock Springs, past buildings that had watched the town's fortunes rise and fall. Dan maintained professional small talk, comments about the weather, the turnout at the service, carefully neutral observations that revealed nothing about what awaited us. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house, all dark wood and leather-bound books. Certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interrupted by photographs of Dan with local dignitaries. It was exactly the kind of place Brianna would have chosen, prestigious but not ostentatious, successful but respectful of tradition. Please have a seat. Dan gestured toward 2 leather chairs in front of his mahogany desk. Dustin claimed the chair closest to Dan, leaving me the one slightly to the side, which felt appropriate given my peripheral status. Dan settled behind his desk and opened a thick file folder, extracting several legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, Dan said, adjusting his glasses, I want to express my condolences again. Brianna was not only a valued client, but someone I considered a friend. Her loss is deeply felt by everyone who knew her. Dustin nodded solemnly. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated. Dan lifted the top document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared his throat. This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Wyoming state law. The will supersedes all previous wills and codicils. Only 14 months ago, I wondered. What had prompted Brianna to update her will so recently? Had she been sick? Had something happened that made her contemplate mortality? The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion. Dan's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings, each word carefully enunciated. Dustin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. I could see the anticipation in his posture, a man preparing to claim his inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire his mother had built. Dan turned to the second page of the will, his reading glasses catching the afternoon light as he continued in his measured, professional tone. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, he read, his voice steady and clear. To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Dustin smiled, a satisfied expression spreading across his face. The Hillcrest house was worth at least $800,000, a substantial property with mountain views and enough space to entertain business associates properly. Additionally, Dan continued, I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate, $500,000, plus the house. I watched Dustin's reaction carefully, noting how his smile flickered slightly around the edges. He was pleased, certainly, but I could see him calculating in his head. $500,000 was significant money, but Brianna's business empire was worth far more. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Dustin said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty he was trying to mask. But what about Mom's business interests? The company? Dan set down the first page and lifted the second, his expression remaining professionally neutral. I'm continuing with the specific bequests. Dustin. Please allow me to finish reading the relevant sections. I shifted in my chair, feeling increasingly like an intruder, witnessing a private family moment. $500,000 was more money than I'd see in several lifetimes. Combined with the house, Dustin was receiving an inheritance that would set him up comfortably for years. It seemed appropriate, natural, even. He was Brianna's son, her chosen successor in life, the person she groomed to understand her world. The bequest to Dustin, Dan continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now, Dustin looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? I'm reading the will as written, Dustin. These are your mother's words, not mine. A tension I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room. Dustin's confident posture shifted, his hands unclenching and reclenching in his lap. I found myself leaning forward despite my intention to remain detached. Let me understand this clearly, Dustin said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from our confrontation at the chapel. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached. And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. Dan removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that seemed designed to give everyone a moment to process what they'd heard. When he replaced them, his gaze moved between Dustin and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of her remaining assets, he said quietly. The company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them, Dustin demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. What are these other provisions? I watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about Dan's manner suggested that we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. The careful way he was parsing his words, the slightly apologetic tone creeping into his voice. It reminded me of the way doctors spoke when they had difficult news to deliver. Before I continue, Dan said, settling back in his chair, I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Flores's final, considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion and consultation, and she was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent, except for the tick of an antique clock on Dan's bookshelf. Dustin stared at the lawyer with growing alarm, while I found myself wondering why Brianna had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. Dan lifted the third page of the will, his eyes scanning the text briefly before looking up at both of us. However, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten. There are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Flores's estate. Dan lifted his reading glasses and looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered his office. Something in his expression made my stomach tighten, a mixture of sympathy and professional obligation that suggested I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. However, he continued, his voice taking on additional weight, the will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Flores's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate. Dustin leaned forward even further, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Finally. Let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments. Dan returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with a deliberate pause, like someone about to deliver life-changing news. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, he read, his words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I felt my mouth fall open, a physical reaction I couldn't control. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. Didn't seem to apply to someone like me, sitting in a lawyer's office in Rock Springs, Wyoming. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million? Yes. Dan's tone remained professionally neutral, but I caught something in his eyes, not surprise, but the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Dustin's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if his blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. What did you just say? Additionally, Dan continued reading, apparently determined to deliver the complete bombshell. I transferred to Jerry Flores, controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and an appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed their minds about how the world should work. Controlling interest in Brianna's company, the empire I'd watched her build from nothing, the business that had eventually consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate. She was giving it all to me. This can't be right. My voice came out as barely a whisper. There has to be some error in the documentation. I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error. Dan removed his glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision. She reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were her exact wishes. Dustin shot to his feet so abruptly his chair rolled backward and struck the wall. This is impossible. She couldn't. He turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something darker. What did you do? How did you manipulate her? I didn't do anything, I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility of what I just heard. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. Bullshit. The word exploded from Dustin like a gunshot. People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow, convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly. Dan's voice cut through Dustin's rising hysteria with professional authority. I can assure you that Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen in my chair, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers Dan had read, $33.5 million. Controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why? I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief. Why would she do this? Dan gathered the will documents into a neat stack, his movements careful and deliberate. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, Mr. Flores. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Dustin's face contorted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? She left him a personal message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin, Dan replied calmly. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what he's getting? Dustin pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized that my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Brianna, stubborn, ambitious Brianna, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything she'd built. That's when Dustin completely lost control. This is fraud, he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. Criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He whirled toward me, his face twisted with fury and disbelief. You did something to her. There's no other explanation. I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of his reaction. Dustin, I swear to you, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick. Liar! He slammed his palm against Dan's desk, sending papers scattering. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone, I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean it. It means exactly that. Dustin's voice rose to a near shriek. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just decided to hand it all over to you? Dan's voice cut through the chaos with professional authority. Mr. Flores, Dustin, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority. Dustin spun toward the lawyer, his eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Dan replied calmly. Mrs. Flores made that very clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision? Dustin's laugh was bitter and sharp. So she did explain why she decided to betray her only son and give everything to the man who ruined her first marriage. She left a personal message for your father, yes. The word father seemed to hit Dustin like a physical blow. For just a moment, his rage flickered, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. He's not my father. Dustin snarled. My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down. He turned back to me, his face contorted with years of accumulated resentment. You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word landed like a knife thrust. Not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Brianna's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world she was creating. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this. Expected? Dustin's voice climbed another octave. You orchestrated this. Somehow, someway, you got to her when she was vulnerable, when she was sick or scared or... That's enough, Dan interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain. Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen her. Then why? Dustin demanded, his voice breaking slightly. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. The pain in his voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw him clearly for a moment, a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn his mother's approval, only to discover she'd given her ultimate validation to someone else. She left a message explaining her reasoning, Dan said gently. Would you like me to read it? Dustin's hands were shaking now, his whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message? She couldn't explain it to my face, but she left a message for him? The message addresses both of you, actually. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Dustin's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as he spoke, I could see the desperate need in his expression, the need to understand why his mother had chosen to shatter everything he believed about his place in her world. Dan was already reaching for another envelope, one with personal message written across it in Brianna's familiar handwriting. Dan raised his hand, commanding silence with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling emotional courtrooms. Enough, both of you. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Brianna knew this moment would be difficult. She asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Dustin slumped back into his chair, his rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding, but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. Dan cleared his throat and began reading in Brianna's own words. My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face. That expression you used to get when I'd rearrange the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, I felt my lips curve into the ghost of a smile. She'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow hearing her voice through Dan's reading made her feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Jerry, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Dan paused, glancing up at both of us before continuing. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. I felt tears starting, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. Dustin, the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up at hearing his name. My beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Dustin's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions too quickly to track. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success. Accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing. Never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. That's not true, Dustin whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dan continued reading. Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me. I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked. Brianna's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken, the sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. Dustin, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect. Dustin made a sound like a wounded animal, but whether from rage or pain, I couldn't tell. Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this. Because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did. The message continued for several more paragraphs, outlining practical arrangements and expressing hopes for both our futures. But the core message was clear. Brianna had chosen love over entitlement, character over expectation, wisdom over wealth. When Dan finished reading, the office fell into profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Brianna had loved me until the end. Dustin stared at the floor, his entire worldview crumbling around him. Finally, Dan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She asked me to give this to you, Jerry. The original is yours to keep. I reached for the letter with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Brianna's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held her letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of her final gift, not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in her eyes, and more importantly, in my own. Dustin was the first to break the silence. This isn't over, he said quietly. But the fire had gone out of his voice. I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since we'd entered Dan's office. I saw a man who had spent his entire life expecting the world to bend to his wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded. Only earned. You could try, I said gently. But your mother was right, Dustin. You're not ready for this responsibility. And you are? His laugh was bitter, hollow. You're a nobody, Dad. A retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions. For a moment, the old Jerry, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with him. But Brianna's words echoed in my mind. You deserve every penny, maybe you're right, I said, standing up slowly. Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire. But I know something your mother valued more than business expertise. What's that? I know the difference between serving others and serving myself. Dustin's face twisted with a final flash of rage. This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly. Dan's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality. Your mother was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when she executed these documents. She underwent extensive psychological evaluations specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening. Then why? Dustin's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why would she do this to me? I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry man who was, despite everything, still my son. She didn't do it to you, Dustin. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth. I don't want that chance. The words exploded from him with the force of 15 years of entitlement and expectation. I want what's rightfully mine. What's rightfully yours, I said quietly, is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with. Dustin stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him realize that something fundamental had changed. The man he'd publicly humiliated that morning, the father he dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for his approval or understanding. You think you've won? He said, gathering his coat with shaking hands. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when he'd entered. This isn't finished. Yes, it is, I said gently. This finished the moment your mother made her choice. The only question now is what you do with the life she's given you. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Dan began organizing papers on his desk, the rustle of documents returning us to practical reality. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. Dan, can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me? Even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. Jerry, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems. About the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different man than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Brianna had seen all of that, and in her final act, she had given me the chance to prove her right.